I'm Carol Doherty. I'm the director of the Newhouse Center for Humanities here at Wellesley, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all here this evening. I think we've got a great evening in store for us, a sort of behind-the-scenes glimpse at what's perhaps more often the unsung process of editing, with New Yorker fiction editor Deborah Treisman and two of her writers, Aleksandar and Hilton Als. As many of you know, Hilton has been in residence this year at the Newhouse as the Newhouse visiting professor of creative writing, and I really owe this whole evening to him. He's put the whole thing together. So let me say a few words about Hilton, and then I'll to introduce him, and then I'll hand things over, and he can take it from there. Hilton Als became staff writer at the New Yorker in October 1994 and theater critic in 2002. He's also written articles for The Village Voice, the New York Review of Books, and was editor-at-large at Vibe. He has received a Guggenheim for creative writing in 2000 and the George Jean Nathan Award for Dramatic Criticism in 2002-03. Hilton is the author of two books, The Women in 1996 and Justin Bond, Jackie Kurtz in 2010, and is currently, as I said, the Newhouse visiting professor of creative writing at the Newhouse Center at Wellesley. So I'm going to let him take it from here, and thank you all very much.
Oh, thank you so much for coming. And one of the best things I heard standing out in the hall just now was a group of students coming in, and they saw Deborah from the side, and they said, "Oh, she's so young." So there's great hope for all of you students who aspire to greatness. I want to thank Carol Doherty and Jane Jackson for being so welcoming this semester at the Newhouse Center and for taking care of so many eccentrics who are passionate about their projects. These stalwart women make sure the limiters are not running the asylum. In addition, I want to extend my gratitude and warmth to the poet and Professor Dan Chasen, who introduced me to the wonderful students and professor at this great institution. Without Carol and Dan and Jane, I wouldn't stand before you now, immensely humbled by your company and the guests we have this evening, New Yorker fiction and fact editor Deborah Treisman, and the novelist, short story writer, and nonfiction writer Aleksandar or Sasha Hemon. We're in the company of two great artists who also happen to be at the top of their field and whose interest, the peculiarity of being, is reflective in their work. As the editor behind writers ranging from Hemon to Alice Munro to David Foster Wallace, Deborah's great strength is in hearing what the author hasn't written and encouraging the poetry of it. Born in England in 1970, she has lived variously in Vancouver, British Columbia, and Berkeley, California. She has edited the landmark collection 20 Under 40 and is the host of the invaluable New Yorker Fiction podcast. In addition to all this, she is the mother of two girls named Natalia and Imogen, whom I like very much, and who are about to be stars in their own right. I won't give you too much of her biography just now, because that's part of the conversation. But after she joined the New Yorker in 1997, it was clear, I had a toupee there, and I forgot to ask her, it was clear that Deborah embodied what was fantastic about the magazine, honoring the subject and the written word while bringing in a sense of the new and the newly possible. And one of the writers Deborah nurtures and who writes with a terrific sense of the possible is the incomparable Aleksandar Hemon. Born in Sarajevo in 1964, Mr. Hemon emigrated to the United States by chance in 1992. I'll have him explain what that sentence during the conversation. He is the author of 4 fantastic books, justly acclaimed, the novels Nowhere Man, 2002, and The Lazarus Project, 2008, and the story collections The Question of Bruno and Other Stories, 2000, Love and Obstacles, 2009. He is the recipient of the MacArthur Genius Foundation grant, among other honors. Tonight, we'll talk to Deborah about her little-known but deeply crucial role as editor, and to Aleksandar about writing, fact, and fiction. And I'm so happy to be with them, and please, let's welcome them. begin at the beginning, this is a very, very strange, almost sort of emotionally pornographic evening for me, because Deborah and I almost never discuss what we're doing. I don't know if this is your experience, but it actually mirrors very deeply how I began writing, which was I would show my mother what I was writing, but I would leave it on the dining room table. She would write her comments. I would pick up her comments the next day, and then we would never discuss it, which is exactly what happened with Deborah. So I'm going to make a theatrical event out of a fairly intimate and personal one. So you'll just have to bear with us while we sort of look at each other quizzically and say, I never knew you felt that way. So here's the first question, and it's for Deborah. I say, writing of his 50-year editing relationship with the great late architectural historian Jane Jacobs, the legendary editor Jacobs Epstein once said that editing has to be about candor in a way that friendship cannot generally take. Meaning, we never tell our friends whole truths, but editors have to. Deborah, how do you maintain the balance between intimacy and candor, particularly with those writers you've worked with over a long period of time?
Well, you mean it's complete avoidance, as you know. Honesty and candor and
He said that friendships can't bear the candor that you
yeah,
have to have.
yeah. It's true, but the way I think about editing is not that it's about telling someone they've done a bad job or, you failed, sorry, it sucks.
Right.
It's really about seeing where they succeeded, where the writer has succeeded, and trying to pull that out, bring it to the surface, and make it encompass the whole piece. So for me, it's never, sometimes it's a matter of saying, you didn't tell us this, or you haven't written about this, or where's that, or I'm missing this, but it's never a matter of just saying, well, occasionally it's a matter of saying start all over, but it's rarely a matter of saying that. It's usually a matter of saying here is what's working. Yeah. And I'm thinking of you and our relationship and editing nonfiction specifically. It's you sort of look at a piece that is in early stages in draft and think about what it could be, think about what it's trying to be, think about what the writer has seized upon as a central thing, which may not be the central thing in the actual execution of it, and then trying to pull that out and restructure a piece around that. A lot of it, I think, is just deeply intuitive. Editing is an interesting thing because although it helps to be smart to be able to do it, there are brilliant people out there who have no idea how to edit. And I notice this by watching people I work with or assistants I hire who might be fantastic readers, and then they sit down and are confronted with a piece and have no idea what to do with it. And somebody else who maybe I didn't think was so promising can sit down and say, oh, well, here's what you do. You put this there, and you take that, you add a piece here, and you do that. And it's just very instinctive. I'm not sure where it comes from.
That empathy is such a great part of it, and putting yourself in the mind of the writer, and the soul, really.
Well, I think this is going to sound very paradoxical when I say this, but I think that the best sign of a good editor is to be completely egoless. And I'm really good at being egoless. I'm the best anti-egotist in town. No, it's just, yes, it's a matter of not trying to impose oneself on a piece. It's a matter of becoming the writer in a sense, to the extent that you can, and seeing what he or she can do, and really hearing the voice. And that's not trying to impose your own voice on something, but trying to make that voice louder.
I remember, Sasha, I don't know if you've had this experience of getting a little note from her that can actually make you burst out laughing because she finds the thing that you're writing before you do. I was writing a piece about Catherine Ann Porter, and I thought I was being so completely brilliant to point out that Eudora Welty had been influenced by her, and in 1963, Eudora Welty had written a story that was about the South. But anyway, Catherine and Porter comes later, and I went on and on and on and on. And Deborah sent me a note back saying, I thought I was reading a piece about Eudora Welty. And so I realized it had to go. Have you had those sort of moments of illumination with Deborah through humor or sadness?
I think there was sadness. Yes, it might be around the corner, but I don't know whether the way she works with me is the same as she is with someone else. I mean, I have no frame of reference. And I don't really even recognize the way. To me, at some point, it becomes a flow of communication. So being a reader is not enough, obviously, but she is a reader. And so I have to start with, I have to have confidence that she will get it as a reader. And then from this, she will help me make decisions that will make it get to the reader faster and better. And we've never had any disagreements. I mean, disagreements in the sense I said, maybe not this, let's do this or not that. I mean, we discussed it, but
we've never fought.
We never argued or anything. Right.
Yeah, we don't talk. We don't fight.
But it's always the way I imagine this. You were talking about the process that you might be going through with her. The word that came to my mind is kind of a flow.
Yeah.
Once I put the text into this flow with someone I trust and I work with, then I can think about it, even if she's not sending me, suggestions. I remember I sent a story and had an ending I wasn't so sure about, and the only thing she said, I don't understand the ending. And I cut the thing, 1,000 words. I just cut it. And then she said, I didn't ask you to cut it at all. She just asked a question, and the question, I lopped it off because of the question. Other things had preceded this in my decision-making process. But once we were in the communication, there was a flow. I could sort of not anticipate precisely, specifically how she would see it, but I had a reader I could trust. And if she had a question, then the question was big.
A recent example of that same process was I've been known to be a little bit headstrong, and the end of the review wasn't really, it was a review and it wasn't really working, but I wouldn't admit that. And Deborah said, I think this ending, and I said, oh yes, and so then I just sent it back as basically missing one word from the shitty ending that I had put on it before. And she's like, well, I think, and suggestions came. So we rewrote it, and it was much better. And then I got an email when the piece came out from a very smart friend of mine saying, oh, I liked your piece so much, particularly the ending. So she's never wrong. I wanted to ask you this because one of your great strengths, and Sasha has pointed this out, is that you don't talk about process very much. You see the work for what it is and what it can be. How, in your way of thinking, does that part of your job in that area differentiate from the fiction part?
Yeah, it's quite different. In some ways. I mean, I think when you're editing nonfiction, sort of the basic thing you have to worry about is information. And if all of the information is coming across, because you're trying to convey factual information. And sometimes it gets buried, it gets put in the wrong place, you need to know it here, you don't know it until there. So that's the first order of magnitude, and then the next order is you start to think about, the beauty of the piece, but it can't be beautiful and not make sense. On the fiction side, for me, the first thing to think about is the voice and the beauty of the writing, and that the story itself will fall into place if those things are in place, and if those things are consistent. So it's you come at it from a slightly different angle. I mean, you work on both things. You work on information and fiction. You work on beauty and nonfiction, but you sort of start in a different place, I think.
When you work, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit here, but now that Sasha's been writing these beautiful nonfiction pieces, particularly the last one, Please Read It, was about going back home, basically. How did these pieces come about from a fiction writer, known as a fiction writer?
Well, that particular piece, Sasha was doing a talk a year or two ago, and in the course of it mentioned an anecdote about how he had gone back to Sarajevo after the siege of Sarajevo, after the war in Bosnia, after not having been there in a long time, and he had noticed himself walking down the street and turning his head to look at something, which was no longer there, but his body had remembered it being there. And it was such a great anecdote that I said, why not write a piece about that? So he did. And it became about many more things.
And it took a while to write it because I started writing it and then other things intervened. And normally I do not send drafts to Deborah, or anyone for that matter. But there was a point when I had written some of it and I wasn't going to be able to work on it until 2 or 3 or how many months later, just to see if it was worth working on. And she, I remember she just said, keep working on it. There were no particular structural suggestions of any kind. And so I kept working on it. I think that, again, I don't know how it works with other writers, but the confidence that I have in Deborah's judgment is partly based on my belief that she knows how I think. It might be entirely delusional. But do not tell me now.
You just reminded me of a fiction writer whom I won't name, who I once sent. Yeah, we had a story by him, and I did a proof on it, which was very light. I mean, it was a few little things here and there, and I sent it off to him. And I hadn't worked with him before that point. And he called me up the next day, and he said, I'll give something away right now. He said, what I sent you was not a draft. It was a finished story. I said, oh, you don't like the suggestions? Well, let's just talk through them. We'll see if there's anything in there that maybe you like. And then he managed to actually come down from his level of indignant response and actually take a few of the things. So yes, people don't always think of what they're sending in as a draft that's ready for editing.
Often when writers send in drafts, writers like me, the thing that I'm hungriest for is a conversation after I've been in my head for X amount of months, or in case of some profiles, a year, or a review. And the conversation I've noticed with Deborah has a lot to do with making me less ashamed of putting myself out there. There's a great deal of shame that goes into writing because, as Gideon noted, there's so much evidence of being humiliated, which is to say public. And I think that every writer's psychology is very different. So anyway, the point is that Deborah comes at it at she wants to put the family together in this way that's very beautiful. And that's my segue into it. Tell me a little bit about your background, because I know you come from a family of scientists, and who are academics, who are scientists, and you diverged from the family business of it.
Yeah, well, in my family, my mother and my father and my stepfather and my sister and my brother and my cousins and my aunt and my uncle are all university professors. So in different fields, actually, not all straight science. And my mother, who ended up as a cognitive neuroscientist, did her undergraduate in French and Italian Renaissance literature. And at that point got a sort of fellowship to study whatever she wanted in a kind of postgraduate setting, and she decided to switch to cognitive psychology, and I said, oh, you don't want to do that. That's just rats and mazes. Stay with something nice and feminine, like Renaissance literature. So
she was like, okay.
Yeah.
I'll do that little thing for you. Yeah.
So yeah, the atmosphere, but my childhood was I was very much immersed in literary things, and my father was a huge reader and also wrote poetry and so on. And he was very versed in that. So and also when I moved countries twice, as a, before I was 9, and you do that, it tends to throw you back on your own resources a lot, and so you withdraw, and if you're a child from a family of academics, you withdraw into books. I was the youngest of 4. The oldest, my sister, who, grew up alone with my parents for a period of time, I think learned to read at 18 months and took books into her crib with her. Instead of stuffed animals, she had books clutched to her. So that was the example that was set at home. Yeah. So anyway, then I didn't want to become a university professor. I don't know why. I thought maybe I should do something different, but still wanted to be literary, work with literature. So this was the outlet I found, and I'm sort of the black sheep. They look at me and say, "Well, you deal with paying people and contracts and mysterious world."
I think for the young people in the audience, can you give us a little bit about the building of your career once you decided that you would edit? You had graduated from Berkeley, but you were already working for.
Building a career is a polite term for sort of just being lucky and ending up in the right place at the right time. It's very difficult to build a career in publishing or in editing because there are so few great jobs out there, and you have to kind of finagle your way into them. I was at Berkeley and met Wendy Lesser, who was still is the editor of the Threepenny Review, and happened at that moment to have decided that she needed an assistant, which she'd never had before. So I had some great months sitting in Wendy's former apartment, which had become her office. She taught me how to use a sponge to seal 6 or 7 envelopes at the same time when sending out direct mail. So now I'm very good at sealing envelopes. I learned other things, because she had no one else. I was reading a lot of manuscripts and assessing them and sort of witnessing editing firsthand, which you get to do more rarely in a bigger company. From there, I applied for an internship at Harper's, which still has a great internship program. It's very intensive. You work for 4 or 5 months full-time for nothing. And at the end of it, you maybe come out with some referrals to other places, but you've learned a lot about magazines and how they work. And my great triumph there was that I actually pulled a story out of the slush pile of unsolicited manuscripts that went in the magazine. So that was sort of unheard of, so I felt really proud of that. And I went from there. I freelanced for a while. I ended up at the New York Review of Books briefly, and then was hired away at 23 to run a magazine called Grand Street, which is where I met you, and which doesn't exist anymore, but was a literary quarterly, which was had fiction, poetry, also art, and definitely had a mandate to be somewhat on the more experimental side, and we did a lot of literature and translation. But it was small enough that I think no one realized how foolhardy it was to put the entire magazine in the hands of a 23-year-old. And I got to, also I didn't have any, I think there have been 2 or 3 people in the previous year. So no one had had a chance to really build up a great example of doing a good job. So I didn't have to improve on someone who was hard to improve on. I just got to learn on the job and deal with printing presses and deal with designers and all these things that I hadn't done before. And at the same time, everything that went into the magazine went through my computer. So I took a great amount of pride in that. And then after 4 years there, I felt, maybe it was time for a bigger audience. I at your instigation, called up then fiction editor Bill Buford and said, "Hey, how about a job?" And he said, "Well, we don't have anything, but how about lunch?" And so we had lunch, and then it took a very long time, but eventually he sort of created a position for me which hadn't existed before, and I was hired on. And then 5 years later, he left editing and switched over to writing, and I got his job. So that's the full course of my career. And there's a lot of just serendipity in there.
And the wonderful thing about writing and editing, of course, is that so much of it is chance. And you say that you found a story that they published in Harper's in the Sludge Pile. That's chance, but you also have to have the eye to know what the institution is and how the fiction or the fact can actually sort of serve itself and the institution simultaneously, which is one of the points that I wanted to get to, which is that the editing process that I've seen with you and other people at the New Yorker is not only dealing with this tremendous flow, to use your word, or influx of words and ideas and writers, but you also have to deal with the institution as it exists and what that institutional voice is and what that institution doesn't do, etc. So when you have people like Sasha Hemon or David Foster Wallace who have incredibly strong voices, you know it at once, and then you have to basically translate it to people who had never heard them before. How did you and Sasha come together as writer and editor?
That was, I was in my early days at the New Yorker. I think it was 99. And Sasha, I think well, you can tell that part of the story, had relatively recently started writing in English, and I think had published a story in Plowshares.
Yeah.
And signed up with an absolutely fantastic agent called Nicole Araji, who sent me a very long piece that Sasha had written. I think it was 40 or 50 pages.
25,000 words.
Yeah, it was long.
But they were all short.
No, there were some very long words in there. Some of which you'd made up. It was very disconcerting. And I love this piece, and obviously it was, much too long to be published in the magazine, and but I thought I could make something from it work, so I ended up compressing and cutting and working out a story that was maybe 8,000 words or something in the end from that longer manuscript, and Sasha didn't say no, and that was that.
Yeah, it was more difficult than that because no, but when the compressing, I accepted it because I understood that a 25,000 story word by a new writer would not be published in New York or anywhere for that matter. But I thought it'll get me to a book, and within the book I'll have the full range of my talent will be in the book. But there were other things, and I remember being upset. I was only angry at the time, and then. The process was not clear to me, but it seemed to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that I only talked to you, but Bill Buford was sending in his suggestions, some of which I found objectionable, and then I would sort of yell at you over the phone.
Yeah. The way the New Yorker has a fiction department. It's not just me. There are now 2 other people who edit fiction and an assistant and so on. And when I was the deputy fiction editor, Bill was above me and would, weigh in on anything we were publishing. And now I do the same thing to the other editors in the department. Probably people yell at them for the proofs I do on their stories, but there's a give and take there. Yeah, I remember you not being so crazy about his suggestions, but you were very good about mine.
I was. But I think that's important. I was thinking about it when I was thinking about this conversation, because it is out of this, a conflictual situation, relatively speaking, that, we established a sort of a foundation for our relationship. I like to think that I know what I'm doing when I write. Things don't just come out and then they're there. I tend to be able to explain to myself and others, if they care, why the word is here, or why things are like this in the story. And early on, it was difficult. It seemed to me, at least I was sensitive to that. I was sensitive to the possibility that people would not know, that they would think that I did not know what I was doing. I was much too vain to accept that. And so after this arguing, and I was never really, I was yelling at the imaginary enemy behind Deborah's back. Right. So I was never mad at Deborah as such. But in this conversation, they were sort of, we earned each other's respect. At least she earned mine.
I feel that I want to earn hers continually because I've been known to have a sharp word for authority generally, and Deborah doesn't let me sabotage myself by being stupid about the possibilities of what I can do as a writer. I think, as Sasha pointed out, I think what it is, Sasha, is that someone is not saying no, right? That this person that you're going to is not, the first response is not no. And so when you talk to Deborah by email mostly, and sometimes on the telephone, it's the welcoming aspect of it that makes you want to do your best, even though you can be exhausted and hysterical. She will make you sit down and write that other 500 words or 1,000 words, because she's not saying no. She's saying, if you do this, the world is yours for the week that it's out or the 2 weeks or whatever. And you do feel that. But I'm glad that you said that about initial resistance, because no writer, no thinker really likes to sort of be reshaped what they're thinking and writing in. So I'm glad that she was able to see it immediately in you. And I wanted to ask you about your writing and the other half of the story that was said you can tell yourself.
Well, it's a longer story, but I'll edit it in front of Deborah. I was born in Sarajevo in '64, many years ago, and then was working as a young journalist and was writing some fiction and even poetry. But I wasn't even earning a living. I was just working as a journalist. But then there was I was invited to come to the United States for a visit in '92 as a young journalist, and went around under the auspices of the United States Information Agency, no longer in existence. And this was, and then went to see a friend in Canada, and then came to see a friend in Chicago. And then the war in Bosnia broke out. So I had to decide whether to go back, which would have been logistically difficult apart from all the other things. And I decided to stay in Chicago, and so I live in Chicago still. But then I had to decide what to do with my writing. I had serious writing ambition in that that's what I thought I was doing, that's what I was. I had no other training or had no interest in anything else. And I decided to switch the languages. I had been able to speak English. I had been taking courses, in various schools, and was listening to rock and roll, and the movies were not dubbed. So I was adept. I mean, I could communicate when I went on this tour. I could talk. There were no articles in my sentences, and I could shape things that I didn't know the name for. That thing. But it's entirely different kind of language that you need when you want to write. And I like to use a lot of words. And so it took me about 3 years to convert writing part of the brain into English. And then I started writing stories in English.
Can I just jump in for a second when you said convert over that 3-year period? Can you just be a little more specific?
Well, because the war was on in Bosnia, I felt that I was cut off from my native language and I could not write in it. And then I realized that since I would have to live in the United States, as I made the decision to stay on, I would have to write in English. Because I don't think that language is so metaphysically embedded. I mean, it's a matter of daily practice. You write in the language you live in. That's my position. So I was reading a lot and making lists of words and rereading things that I had read in translation or even in the original language, and making notes. And then I gave myself a 5-year, it was an arbitrary deadline. I gave myself 5 years to be able to write a publishable story in English. But for one reason or another, I got desperate enough after 3 years, and I wrote a story in English, which was published in Tri-Quarterly, a Northwestern University literary magazine. and then wrote a few stories, one of which was the one that reached Deborah, and assembled a book out of it, which is The Question of Bruno. At some point in the mid-90s, I went back to writing in my native language and started writing a column in Bosnian, which I then wrote for 15 years or so. But stopped writing it last December for some reason.
What was the column? Was it about your life here? Or?
It was about they do not edit there. If I had sent them my grocery list, they would have published it probably. And I don't need much proofreading, so here and there, if the proofreader was available, they would proofread it. Otherwise, they published it. But it was just about a lot of it was about my life here, or the life of displaced Bosnians, and there are a lot of them. A lot of it was complaining about the Bush administration, and before that about the Clinton administration. And then a lot of it was common past. The thing with Bosnian experience is that there's a vast diaspora now, proportionally speaking. And so in new generations who grew up in entirely different circumstances, historical circumstances. So the common past becomes something that needs to be narrated to be available, in a sense. Personally, and then also, I suppose, collectively. And so I spend a lot of words remembering certain things that I thought would be important to remember.
How hard is it to switch between languages?
Well,
when
now,
you're writing?
now there's no, I do not notice. What I learned in the 90s when I was converting, and I mean, I can say it now, I was not aware of it then. I was just reading and trying to find enough language, is that your subconscious mind, or my subconscious mind, has to be, the language has to be in your subconscious mind, whatever the language you're writing in. English was external to my subconscious mind for obvious reasons. I was not living in it prior to my arrival. But then, in the 90s, the early 90s, for various reasons, it got in, and still there. And in fact, I remember then finding it strange that I would notice that I was dreaming in English. That in my dream, I would notice people speak English. And even more bizarrely, I remember remembering in English. That is, I remember conversations with my parents and friends in Sarajevo, that they would be conducted in my head in English, and of course knowing all along that they would not have been conducted in English.
That's amazing. Do you know that story of Saul Bellow when he was in Paris, and he didn't know how to start the Adventures of Augie Mark. He didn't know how to find his Yiddish American voice until he lived in a country where he didn't speak the language at all. And he was crossing a street and he saw a puddle, and he remembered the word for puddle in Yiddish, and somehow the character's voice came to him then. Did you feel, when you started to make those lists of words and to really sort of dig into the concrete of your past and build out of it, build your future out of it, did you have a great sense of excitement about this new language, or did it feel too hard?
I mean, I'm not prone to excitement.
Okay.
I am.
I'm prone to
the wrong kind.
I'm prone to constant states of delirium. So I need to reject it.
You don't want me excited.
Yeah.
No, but excitement is not the word. I was doing it out of despair. And despair is a great ally in that it sort of reduces your choices to one or two things. And so I wouldn't have to, deliberate, should I do this? What's better for me? It was only one thing to do, or two things maybe, and that's the things that I did. But there was excitement, a readily excitement, because it's a beautiful language. Suddenly all these things were becoming available. I still find great joy in simply using words. I mean, this is what writers do. Even when talking, I like to chew on the word. It gives me pleasure. And so, one of the things I was reading a lot and writing a lot of words was Lolita, and that's chewable language. And so I would make these long lists, and I would learn these words, and then I would use them. And there was this sense of not conquering, that sounds so aggressive and ambitious, but rather, and acquiring is too psychological, but gathering, collecting things. I was on an expedition, as it were, for survival, and then I was collecting these beautiful things. And language doesn't go away once it's in your subconscious mind. I do not forget words. I mean, that might be coming up, but I have them. And I have very little property, but my property is this language that I acquired. It was unplanned, and didn't quite fall into my lap, but here I have it now. It's beautiful, and I did not lose the previous language, so I have two languages. So there was that. It wasn't excitement in the sense that, I'm going to get this down, I'm going to do great things. It was the excitement of waking up in the morning and my life was rather bleak. And then you would have, one or two Nabokovian words to hold on to.
I have to say that was also what was remarkable in that first story that I got from Sasha, and every other story since, was he sent me to my dictionary more than any other writer, since Nabokov, probably. And to know that this was written by a non-native speaker who had this vocabulary and the ability not only to use words correctly that he learned, but also to improvise with them and to use them in ways that native speakers wouldn't think to do. And I remember very clearly there's one story, Smurrow's Room, where he described someone who's sort of curling up. Now any native speaker would probably say curling up in a fetal position in a corner, and he said he was shrimping. And instantly you see this shrimp curled up in the corner, and instead of using the obvious thing, he made you see it. And it wasn't, no one else would say shrimping. I mean, if you go to the dictionary, shrimping means fishing for shrimp. So it wasn't the actual meaning, but it was his ability to not only learn the vocabulary, but then to abuse it for his own purposes, which was so amazing.
And also to be free. Because one of the things that you're looking for always is how expansive can a writer be, and how, to invest in them is to invest in allowing for their expansion as a writer. And Sasha, how have you seen your work develop over the years? Or should Deborah answer that?
Well, Deborah can answer. I don't. Development implies kind of a progress, or that I have a plan.
No.
To me, most of my life is, running from one shelter to another, just trying to stay alive. And so, and in fact, I'm experienced enough and old enough to take that as part of the creative process, in that I often find myself in the middle of a story, or before writing a story or a novel, thinking, I lost it. I can't do this anymore. I don't know what I'm doing. And then, in fact, it used to scare me, but now it means that I'm ready for the next thing. That is that all the vanity that I've accumulated, is cleared. So I don't have to repeat things that I've done that I'm proud of and people have praised me for to make myself feel better. But there's this not knowing what to do. It means that I will have to learn how to do it, and that's exciting to me. And then ideally, it would result in some sort of exciting work. But there's also, I think, in relation to the language, or what we were saying about language, to me it always has to be new. I'm more comfortable in it now than I was 20 years ago, obviously. But at the same time, it is not just a thing. It's not like furniture that you're used to sitting on in your living room. It has to be new. And how to renew that instant language for yourself, it's a tricky thing. But I grew up, and even before I started writing in English, I believe that what writers do is they renew language in the act of writing. That and people, in relation to that, people often ask me whether I write the way I write in English in my native language, or whether I use English the way I do because I'm not a native speaker. And I might be the wrong person to talk about it, but it seems to me in my native language I have the exact same strategy. I mean, I look for those words and those little twists to make things and locutions be strange again. So because we get used to the language we constantly produce. There's an ocean of cliches everywhere. And so to make it exciting, it requires some work. My ex-wife was reading my work first in the 90s and the early 2000s. And so she was a native speaker, and so she would read something that I wrote, and she would say, "We don't say this." And I would say, well, now we do.
She was also an English teacher, right?
Right.
Yeah.
But the point being, not that I'm arrogant, I'm going to stick to your language, but rather that unless I feel it's mine, I can't do it.
When you make language new, which is something that you do deeply in your work, I often, when I'm reading a short story of yours, I'll read aloud, just so that I can hear the locution. Have you ever thought of writing a play?
No. Well, I've thought of it, but if it's interesting to me, I want it to be a story. I've been a film buff my whole life, and so periodically I have this ambition to write a script. But I have been writing a script with a friend of mine in Bosnian, but I would have never done it on my own, because if it's a story worth telling, it ends up being a story. Because I need a language, the structure. It's fun writing a script, but all the poetry is removed, all the no shrimping in the script. So I can do it on the side, but not really. It would be fun to do it with someone, so as a collaborative project. What interests me about film and then theater, similarly, is that it would be a collaboration. I would do it for the reason of collaboration rather than any other reason.
Because when I think of your stories, I think, not to embarrass you, but I think of Chekhov's career, where the form wasn't very natural to him at first, writing for the theater, but in that he was able to find a certain freedom and the collaboration. In fact, his wife was an actress who appeared in some of his work. But I think that, I don't want to jinx it, but maybe one day I'll be able to come into your play as well.
Maybe you should talk about writing fact and fiction,
Oh.
because you've been doing both.
Oh.
How are they different for you?
It's horrible. I'm leaving this theater immediately.
I'm taking the shame out of it.
Thank
Remember?
you. Thank you very much. I'm very touched by that. The thing that I like so much about fiction is that I don't have to look anything up. I'm sort of a nut when it comes to research, and I really love it. And the thing that I love, I've been working on a long project, and I stopped to write a story that came as a phrase, really, and the phrase was, I haven't shown it to you yet, but it's called, I think I know he's crazy because he loves me. And then I thought, oh, why don't we just say, I think I know he's crazy when he. And so then the story became the when he part. The characters were able to communicate because they were freed by a sentence that I chopped in half. So the fiction part of it for me is feeling the freedom and also being able to write about experiences without having to call in real life experiences. I like metaphor, and I also like not knowing what's going to happen. Some writers can write the ending of a story. Well, actually, I never know how it's going to happen in nonfiction either, but even if I've had the experience, the great thing about writing in general, fact and fiction for me, is that I don't know how it's going to turn out, and I don't know what my feelings will be. I'm not, for all of the research, I'm not an intellectually inclined writer. It has to be an emotional response first, and then thinking follows for me. So in writing fiction, the things that I've written so far have always been an emotional response to an event or a memory. And in nonfiction, weirdly, with profiles and long critical pieces, it's someone that I want to connect with and understand. Even if I don't particularly admire them, I feel a deep need to connect to their experience. When we've worked on people like Richard Pryor or well, it's something that you pointed out once when I was being edited by someone else for a while, and she was at a loss about a particular piece that I was doing, and you came into the office after she had asked you to read it, and you said Hilton is really interested in people who are kind of like in the margins of things. So if you can find the marginality of this person, that's the power for him. And so I have very, very little interest, for instance, in rich people, except when they take me to dinner. I have very, very little interest in overt signs of wealth or power. I'm interested in the internal life and also how does someone survive not being in the status quo. So, as you know, the experience of even writing about someone who was as famous as Jane Fonda, what was really interesting to me was how feminism had, dissipated as a sort of cultural force, and how she was still supporting a women's center where they met, and how had her life, I don't even know how that woman gets out of bed given what she comes from, but she was still able to find, as she said, love on the horizon, mostly with older women, women who, her mother committed suicide, so she was always drawn to older women who could tell her things, say, Jane, don't do that, and that's not the way to respond to things. So I feel emotionally connected to people first, and that's where the ideas come, the ideas follow. It's always the emotional connection for me first. I'm looking at the clock and I know that I can feel about a gazillion questions coming at us. Carol, I think that's right about now, yeah? So let's take some questions and then you can have your supper. Does anyone have questions for Deborah or Sam? Hello. Hi. Yes. What's your name? Hi. Oh, great.
Virtually. Okay. Can I de-edit it? I think okay. I'm thinking specifically right now of Hilton's pieces, and because Hilton does send me drafts and does send things when they're partially written, and he's still thinking about them and processing them. And for me, what's salient is that even when everything's a mess, it's all in the wrong order, we're not getting what we need to know, I have no idea where he is or what he's doing.
I'm not telling.
Even when something is in such a preliminary stage, there is inevitably an idea embedded in it. And that's the idea, which is what he's going to end up wanting to be the through line of the finished piece. And so I will look at these things, and instead of doing what my instinct is to do, which is clean it all up, I will say, I will tell myself, stop, don't clean it up, it's not ready to be cleaned up. Instead, dig in it, dig around and see what the thought is, because there's always one there, and that's what makes it such a wonderful thing to work with him, because I work with, I've worked with many writers for the last 20 years or so, and some of them have been very neat, perfect writers who get across what they want to say, but they haven't really had ideas, and I haven't learned that much from their work, and I'm not going to name any names, but and it doesn't happen that often, but sometimes you get someone who's a very competent writer, but doesn't have the sort of originality or brilliance of thought, and so with nonfiction, it's a matter of finding where the brilliance is and trying to make that be the center of the piece. With fiction, it's more about my ear than my brain, I suppose. It's hearing the voice. It's hearing it aloud. It's hearing whether this is a credible character, or if it's meant to be incredible, whether it's succeeding at that. It's something about hearing how a story is told, and I don't worry so much about what the story is. I worry about how it's being told, and whether it's maintaining its ambition to tell it in that way. Whether the writer has said, "Here's how I'm going to tell this story," and maybe halfway through has lost touch with that. That happens, and then sort of nudging her or him back to what the original aim seemed to be at the beginning of the story. Well, the fact that these two people have gotten to where they are means that they don't need me. They know something about balance. There is an element of being an editor which is also being a shrink. It's true, and that goes to looking deeper into things to see what the intention is, and I suppose that's what shrinks do. I haven't been one, but. Yeah, so I suppose it's that helps maintain the balance, and I think for most writers, what is most important to them is having a reader who understands. So you have to simply try to understand, and that is usually a balancing force.
It's not, it is to understand, and it's a tricky thing, but it's more than, understand the word as a range, and to understand analytically the way that, an adept reader, you said it in different words, an adept reader could understand the story is one thing, but then to understand what might be under the surface and bring it even more to the surface, but then to understand how difficult it might be for the writer to deal with things that is in the piece, which, for me, I wrote a very difficult piece about the death of my daughter, and I would have never submitted to anyone but Deborah. And would not have considered it during with anyone with Deborah, because it's so difficult to write and so difficult to, it's a difficult thing to edit, I would think, whether you're editor or writer. That the understanding, it's not just reading a piece and then thinking, well, this paragraph could go down to here.
Yeah.
There's far more than that, and there's a kind of confidence, because writing is always simultaneously a public and an intimate act, particularly nonfiction of that sort. And so to open yourself up to someone, it's not that I don't do that because I think people will hurt me, but rather that to find some comfort or even joy in that act. And then the person on the other side, the editor in this case, Ms. Treisman, to trust that it's a process that will bear fruit. That is very important. So we've reached a point in our relationship that I come up with ideas and then run them by her. I didn't used to do that. I would just write a story and send it to her, or my agent would send it to her. But sometimes I would just send it to her directly. It happened a couple of times. But now I've reached the point where I can discuss ideas with her, and then she says yes or no, or David Remnick says yes or no. But it's it is understanding, technically speaking, but it's beyond understanding. There's a network of relations inscribed in that word.
It's very interesting with Deborah. I feel utterly exposed, and I have that horrible sweat on me now, because writing for me is such a beautiful way of retreating, right? And this conversation has been mind-blowing for me on a lot of different levels, but my shrink will deal with it next week. And But one of the things that Deborah pointed out that is really very true, and has to do with trust, is that I write very differently for her than I do anybody else in the world. And the reason is, and Jason Epstein pointed it out, I won't name the person that he was comparing me to because it's just too much, but he said, whom he had also edited, he said it is utterly weird how it's the same process. Because he lived across the street from me in Sag Harbor. He was looking at some things on my desk, and he said, Tuesday, this is what you handed in, and then Thursday you did this. And I said, because I'm talking. Who knows what the conversation is going to be by Friday? I know I have to finish the conversation by Friday, but you have those 3 or 4 deliriously, for me, happy days of deciding. And I think when I write for other people, it is finished work. When I write for Deborah, it isn't finished work because I'm being myself, which is to say unfinished. And I'm being utterly exposed and real with her, which is to say, on Tuesday, I know I was a Goomtar. On Thursday, I'm completely brilliant. On Friday, may I go have a martini now? I'm finished. And so, it's just she is a remarkable person in allowing me to be messy. And she's learned over the years. Initially, I would say, please don't fix it. She would immediately start working, and I'd say, don't fix it. I'm still talking. I'm still thinking. That's how we work now. Hey, Emily. This is a wonderful writer, and Emily. She speaks true. Yeah.
I would never actually think to separate it into tool or beautiful thing. It's kind of, if it's not doing both at once, it's failing somehow. For me, language has always been central. As I said, I grew up a reader and sort of insisted against all financial sense that that was what I wanted to go on being, or that I perhaps could make a living doing that. And so it's, I suppose I'm not a writer, but I get maybe a similar thrill out of learning language that other people get out of producing it. And so when I'm editing, I am learning about the possibilities of language, and I studied foreign languages in college, and nothing was more fun for me. Actually, going to Russian class was a delight. It was sort of a high point of my day. Weirdly, yeah. I mean, I realize it's nerdy, but I was nerdy and still am. But it's something about a case system. How does this work? And for me, it's like, I get the thrill out of it probably that mathematicians get out of problem solving. Language is a problem and a gift, so those things are bound up together for me.
I think I'm obsessed with language, and this is why I'm a writer. But however, whatever aspect of language you name, I'm deeply invested in it. I'm a writer partly to relieve this pressure of obsession inside my head with language. When I'm alone at home, I babble to myself in Bosnian constantly, mainly in the voice of a Sarajevo thug. But I mean, I constantly produce sounds with my mouth. There must be some disorder that would cover that. And I think in language. I mean, we all think in images too, but I am very not intelligent unless I'm using language, including in dialogue. This is why working with Deborah is important. And which is why I also like teaching. if I sit alone in the room and stare at the wall, I am likely to fall asleep. But if I talk to someone and then someone on the other side is intelligent enough or producing ideas, it stimulates me in a way that it allows me to operate at an entirely different level. I actually produce thoughts in dialogue. Even if it's in imagery, just by sending a story to Deborah, I start thinking how I would define what I did here, why it is this way, not that way. And if I can't define it, that usually means she's right, that it's an arbitrary choice. And in art, I don't think that choices should be arbitrary. I should know what I'm doing, even if in retrospect. So to me, literature is made of language. What is fascinating about, and not just literature, but much of human experience, what Chomsky, the local boy, said, that language is a discrete combinatory system, which means that from a finite number of elements, you can make an infinite number of combinations, even if some of them are prohibitive. And to combine these things endlessly is certain, I mean, there's absolutely a certain obsessive aspect to it. I play with the words, obsessively. And then, at some point, I organize those words beyond obsessing. And that the whole range of dealing with language is all I ever do. That's all I do. That and playing soccer.
I think the truth is, Emily, that that writing for me comes from two places. One is that I come from an enormous family of women, so getting a word in was impossible. And I started writing to respond to what I heard around the dinner table. And as Deborah can attest, I have sort of an incredible visual memory for things, and the phrase that will be the truth of what the person, I just could hear it and I could see it. And then it extended into more visual work for me. The people that I felt closest to, of course, were writers, but equally important to me were people like Dionne Arbus, who said that she could be anyone when she took that person's photo. So for me to do a profile, I just learned, I call it Stanislavski writing, where you become the person. So the joy for me is not being myself, and then applying myself after the fact. But I like very much becoming someone else and then figuring it out as myself. It's a sort of what we were talking about in class today, basically. Hi. Yes. Some of the early stories before I even finished the book in Bosnian. I guess it was in '97 or so, and took them to Sarajevo to show them to my friends. But then my friends showed it to a publisher, and then I published the book, even if it wasn't really finished, in Bosnian, the translations. And then when the book came out, the way that things happened, when they printed, they looked different from the way they when they longhand, which is how I write originally, and then when they on a printed on a computer screen, then printed as a manuscript. It turned out they were awful translations, because
They were the same thoughts in presumably two languages, but there was a large overlapping area. So I would use, there were Bosnian words in English syntax, with English syntax, with English sentences, or the other way around. There was some, because they did not copy it there was some wrongly translated word. And I know all this, I would have known all this had I isolated the sentence of the word. But in this flow, because it was mine, I screw it all up. And from then, I do not translate. I have supervised, and my work, I have supervised, translation, supervised. There was someone translated and I edited it, but not really to check whether she translated correctly, but rather I would do things that she did not dare do out of respect for my work. So I would cut out the paragraph, and so on. As for displacement, the funny thing about language is that, displacement is about place to a large extent, but you carry your language around. And then if you get an additional language, well, that's good. I do not see myself as being split between places, living between two places. I see myself in many ways living in two places simultaneously. And not even simultaneously is not precise enough. It is that I understand this place, and this is what the piece, in the most recent piece in New Yorker is about, that I started living in Chicago and adopted as my hometown, as it were, because I applied the structures of my original hometown to Chicago. I understood it because I applied the knowledge that I had brought with me. So in some ways, it's not that I see English as a new language now because it's so deeply embedded, but whatever sensitivity I acquired in Sarajevo, and this is an entirely different story, in Bosnia, which is linguistically a very interesting place for a number of historical and political and cultural and ethnic reasons. Many things flow into that space, many sources flow into that space, and the language is very rich. And I had always been obsessed with language. That sensibility I could carry into English because English is responsive to that, the English language. It is, it is the language of puns, for one thing. It's easy to do that. Nabokov was once kind of lectured by Edmund Wilson, who told him, we don't do puns in English.
We don't.
It's crass, but he did. Yeah. We do now, that's right, and we did. So language is a homeland, as it were. But then you can have more than one.
Yeah. Oh, Emily, I feel like I didn't finish your question, and I really remember this great moment in my writing life. I was writing about a woman named Dorothy Dean, and she was very quick-witted and very short-tempered. And I knew that she drank a lot, so I said, I'll just drink a lot, and a lot more to understand her, a lot to understand her, and then I didn't get the character until I realized that if you drink a lot, you have a hangover all the time. And so she was hungover.
Oh, she was mad.
Yeah, she was hungover. She was irritated because she was hungover, and then I could write the piece. Yes.
Well, it took away one level of authority and supervision, which I had beforehand. So I certainly have more say in terms of what's going into the magazine. So David Remnick has to approve everything. Instead of having someone looking over my shoulder, I now look over other people's shoulders. So, I don't know whether that's a good thing or not. But yeah, I suppose it became easier to publish certain stories which have not particularly appealed to Bill. I mean, we had similar taste a lot of the time, and then there were some things that I liked that he didn't, some things that he liked I didn't, and so I had more freedom with that, definitely. It's very hard to say type. I'm not really sure there are types of stories. I mean, there are writers who are very individual. I don't think anyone's writing like Sasha. I don't think she's doing a type of story. So that's just hard for me to pinpoint. I think it's more, it's just really on a completely brainless level. It's about your gut response and your instinctive response to a piece of writing. And you know, people often ask me if I write fiction, and I don't write fiction. And I see this, maybe other people don't, but I see this as a very good thing for this job, because when you write fiction, you have to be wedded to what you specifically are doing in order to do it well. And I have to be open to anything. And I feel as though I can have a very positive response to very different stories, so long as the writer, as long as I'm in good hands, as long as the writer is doing what he or she is trying to do. I'm going to appreciate that, I hope. Right. I actually, agents, a lot of agents do handle stories these days. There is still a chance, and it does still happen. It's happened maybe 4 or 5 times in the last couple of years. I mean, it definitely happens. It happens a lot less than it used to, because agents used not to handle stories. Whether it's possible to get a story in the magazine without an agent coming in over the transom. So, you know, stories come in many different ways. They'll come directly from a writer, they'll come from a writer I know, they'll come from a writer I don't know, they'll come from an agent, a publisher. I've had stories sent in by someone's, you know, friend or girlfriend, you know, that we've ended up taking. So the door is open, but it does tend to be that the people who've reached a certain level with their writing have also reached a certain level in terms of acquiring an agent. Fairly often what happens is that there'll be a story in the stockpile that has promise, and one of our readers will pull it out and pass it along. And we often won't do that story, but the editor who takes it over from the intern or reader will end up writing a personal letter back to the writer, and then a correspondence will happen, and sometimes we would take that person's next story, or a story 5 stories away, by which time they may have gotten an agent, you know, who knows. But so there are a number of writers who we kind of keep an eye on and think, well, eventually we're going to have a story that works, you know, for our purposes. Anyone can self-publish. They're not going to get the readership. So I don't think that has actually changed what the magazine does. I mean, what the magazine does is get your story out to more than 1 million people. And putting it online, you know, officially you could reach more than 1 million people, but you're not going to without a sort of an imprimatur of an institution behind you, or a desk.
Young man on strike. Well, I don't know. Things change. You know, if I grew up in the United States and grew up in Oklahoma and then left and moved to New York, that part of my life would be as distant to me, you know, as my life in Sarajevo might have been. But there are the ways that you are raised as a person, and the way you interact with other people. There are habits that you form, and those habits I have not lost in many ways. And you know, whether I only drink strong coffee. Or whether I, you know, dislike certain ways of. I like to touch people when I talk to them and so on. Those are habits that you acquire very early on, and that defines me. But at the same time, I've lived in the United States for 20 years, and
I'm 100% Bosnian and 100% American at the same time. I don't have to choose. Nobody really forces me to choose in any way. I can combine it all. If I can add some more, I would add some more. So I could be French, why not? Brazilian is not bad, too. I have a few more years to live, so I'll pile it on.
Your international generosity and Deborah as well. It's been such an illuminating conversation, not just for me, I hope, but for everyone here. And thank you all for coming. And I want to thank our distinguished friends.